if I don't turn media on, I don't feel a lot of anxiety. Like I feel pretty good. It's
true.
Give me 30 minutes in front of Fox News or MSNBC, and my blood pressure will go up by 12 points.
The way I frame it is it crosses the streams, to use the Ghostbusters reference, right? There's some things that ought not be together, and it puts them together.
I shouldn't argue. If you're 99% confident on this, I'm not going to even have a chance to argue with you. So let's just talk about how you got there.
But most people, when they discover that libertarianism is a thing, they just try to import everything about themselves into it, which is why they get themselves into so many arguments. It's tragic, really.
Yeah, and then they do ridiculous things like starting podcasts.
No, that's our narcissism, my friend. Don't get it confused.
And was that convincing for that person?
No, it never is.
It never is. Welcome back to Drop the Mask. I'm your host, Jason. Who else would it be? I don't even know why I say that. I just hear other podcasters do it and it sounds professional or something. Anyway, I'm here. I'm running the show. And last time I left off saying that I was probably going to take a little break from the show. Well, that may not be true. I just can't quit. I think there are some opportunities coming my way, so we'll see. But I am taking some time to reflect, and that's what this episode is about. It's a continuation of the last one, looking back at the interviews I've done and taking the chance to piece together the wisdom that each of my guests has brought. Every one of them has some great ideas and a good way of talking about them. I honestly don't know why some of these people said yes to come talk to me, but I am grateful. I left it off in part one with a few thoughts about the Libertarian Party. I'm pretty much out on it right now. I kind of already knew that the political solutions just weren't going to work, and I'm also not a fan of the direction that the party went starting from the lead up to the 2024 convention. It took me a minute to figure it out for myself, but the party is just not the same as the Liberty Movement. And as Andrew Heaton said, and I showed in part one, that if we want people to join the movement, we need to make it inviting. And it's certainly not that right now. Maybe the closest that libertarians have come to that ideal so far was the Ron Paul movement back in 2008. Now, I wasn't paying that much attention at the time, but so many people had their libertarian awakening during that era. And ironically, he ran in the Republican Party, something that I probably would have been disappointed with if I had seen that today. But a lot like Bernie Sanders on the other side, the party and the entrenched powers really boxed him out. And as hard as they tried, they still couldn't stop people coming together and the energy that brought behind him. This is where one of my guests specifically called out that he got excited about the ideology, and I've heard it from a lot of other people as well. But this is Kyle Anzalone from the Libertarian Institute, and in that episode we mostly discussed the Ukraine war, something I'm not going to touch today, but he did reminisce on that time that brought a lot of people into the libertarian fold. Here it is.
Yeah, so I got started kind of on this path, just being a libertarian back in 2009. I found Ron Paul. It was right after the 2008 campaign. And so then I was in college for the 2012 campaign, which was really awesome. Like, as far as it goes, I think from my time in the libertarian movement, like, that's the high watermark. I don't know how long you've been a libertarian or if people in your audience remember, like, back to this time. Ron Paul was legitimately, like, selling out arenas. I went to one of his events at University of Illinois. The basketball arena was packed. The line was around the block when we pulled up, and everybody was just so friendly. Even waiting in line at these events was like some of the best times I've had in the Liberty movement, right? There's another event at University of Wisconsin-Madison. They sold out the arena, so they moved it outside. And Ron Paul is just speaking outside, and there's people up in the trees. They're on top of buildings. Like, it was just insane. So there was so much energy in the Liberty movement then. And of course, Ron Paul's message wasn't do everything you can to get me elected. He, educate yourself, benefit yourself so you can aid the cause of liberty in the future. And I really, I think I took that message very seriously.
So yeah, like I said, I missed the Ron Paul thing. It sounds awesome, but I was only tangentially aware of what was happening in 2008 and 2012 when he ran. I really wasn't into politics at all, which also means that I'm fairly new to this. It was kind of around 2016 or 17 that I started really becoming politically aware. And I'm still learning, but looking back and seeing clips of him speaking out against the corruption in the system as a sitting US congressman, he was pretty much the only one doing it. So I can see why people got excited about it in a system where Republican and Democrat were still fairly synonymous, even in the way they talked. I think the separation today is becoming bigger, and that's probably why things feel so contentious at the moment. But it would definitely be good to try to keep people from going after each other too much, because we're not each other's enemies. Regular people like you and me are just not against each other. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat or which brand of libertarian or anarchist you might be. We may have political differences at times, but we're all humans. We all have similar wants and needs in the end. There are some bad guys out there for sure who are more than happy to have you enslaved and meet their twisted ends, and there might be no reaching those people. But okay, there are still so many of us out there that we just want better. And to find those people, it can't be all about politics. So I'm going to go back to Adam Haman, where I asked him about his position that libertarians spend too much time in the weeds on politics. Let's hear what he has to say. Libertarians spend too much time on politics, and you agreed. So what do you mean by that?
I mean many things. First of all, people should live their lives first and make that as rewarding as they possibly can. Fulfilling family, good job, pursue their passion, have a well-rounded life. But then also I think libertarians try to fit their entire philosophy into political philosophy, and that's an error. Political philosophy is only a tiny sliver of philosophy. You've got metaphysics and ethics and epistemology and all the rest that you might want to delve into. And what libertarian political philosophy is just what the laws of a society should be, the size and scope of government, or if government should even exist, but it doesn't tell you how to live your life, which is why I think it's such a huge error to be either a quote, left libertarian or a right libertarian. Your own personal views on how to live your life and what good moral behavior is doesn't have anything to do with what the law should be. The law should be focused narrowly on property rights, freedom of association, the things we talk about when we talk about the non-aggression principle and all the messy issues that come up when we try to apply it to, specific context, the messy real world. But most people, when they discover that libertarianism is a thing, they just try to import everything about themselves into it, which is why they get themselves into so many arguments. It's tragic, really.
Yeah, and then they do ridiculous things like starting podcasts.
No, that's our narcissism, my friend. Don't get it confused.
It is a bit narcissistic to start a podcast, isn't it? And it's still a little weird for me that anyone wants to listen, but again, I appreciate you guys, and I'll be working hard to keep making it better, but yeah, it's a mistake to only focus on politics, something I am keeping at the top of my mind going forward. It's easy to get caught up in it, but it's not everything. It's been a lot more enjoyable for me to talk about things like psychology, philosophy, and science, rather than which politician did what over the last week. I briefly got into some religious themes as well, which is another one of those things that is being engulfed by politics today. And even though I don't identify with any particular religion, I do think the topic is fascinating and important. And I think a big departure from liberty was relinquishing religious roles to the state. And we've seen various forms of that throughout history. There have been times when the state and the dominant religion are one and the same. We've seen complete abandonment and abolishment of religion by authoritarian states, and everything in between. And right now, I think we're in a weird combination of both authoritarian and abandonment, somehow. The need for religion of some kind seems to be an inescapable part of humanity. Worship is in our blood, and even if you take the supernatural out of it, psychologically, we seem to be wired to look for a leader, but more than that, a leader with some kind of superhuman ability, or at least we project that onto them. And that's a form of worship, and at least part of that is probably the mind taking shortcuts again. We know we're flawed, and we would much prefer someone telling us what to do than to have to think about everything for ourselves. So I think people have been slowly abandoning traditional religion, and they put it onto a different authority, the state. And they can call it science or humanism or rationality, but when you dig down, it's government authority that they have put up on the pedestal. That fusing of religion and worship with politics has been a major misstep for mankind, something we really should back away from. And that's not to say that everything in religion is good, but it separates things, the separation of church and state. Those two things should not be combined. And that's one thing that I learned from my more recent conversation with Jason Fry, where he talked about the pitfalls of Christian nationalism.
Well, I was going to talk about, let me talk about Christian nationalism for a second.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Because that's a kind of a flavor on the right of Jesus is a nice guy, and Judeo-Christian ethics are good, better even maybe, they would say. So what if we make that the driving force behind our national government? If our national government was good and based on good moral principles. And that sounds great. It sounds just as great as what if everybody had the services they need. Right?
Yep.
What it fails to respect is the huge diversity within Christianity itself. Right? It is actually, the diversity of Christianity is not respected at all in that Christian nationalism flavor. The other thing that it does poorly is that the way I frame it is it crosses the streams, to use the Ghostbusters reference. Right? There's some things that ought not be together, and it puts them together. The way I tell the biblical story there is the example I use is that Jesus was offered by Satan control of all the kingdoms of the world, right? As one of his temptations. And would that have been a temptation at all if it were not possible? Like if I said, Jason, I'm going to give you $1 billion zillion and make you president of the universe. If I offered you that, could I accomplish that? No, not at all. It's pointless, right? So if Satan can offer political power of the kingdoms of the world, I think that means to some degree he has that. Okay? That's where I'm coming from. And so if you try to take the power of politics, the power of government, mix that with the power of Christ, the power of God in the world to achieve good, and that's like, if we mixed a little Satan in with our God, it would work better. That's the way I see it. You absolutely should have good moral people, Christians even, involved in government and trying to do right by things. I get that. I hope to do that myself. It is better when insane people are not in charge, sure. But to use force and make it that way, not so much, right? Because that force is the power of government, it's the power of the devil, honestly. So that's my take on Christian nationalism. Is they're some good folks, but if you make it to where you're using force to get your good, then that really makes you bad. So.
You don't want to cross those streams. The power of the government is the power of the devil. I don't know if that is literally true, but it's at least on the right track. Whether you believe in an actual God and Satan or not, there's something demonic about the way that the people in power talk about us. We're seen as pawns, as a means to an end, and their ends are not good. They claim to be about saving the earth and helping the poor, but they push policies and act in the complete opposite way. So we shouldn't wonder why so-called public servants end up exponentially growing their wealth while they're in office. The system is set up for them to do that. And I'm not huge on conspiracy theories, but clearly something is going on. As governments continue to accumulate wealth and power, the worse things get. The more it becomes a worldwide phenomenon that affects everybody. So I want to go back to Clint Russell one more time. He talked about the global conspiracy that's happening that is an artificial development in our world. It's not a free market condition. And this is around the topic of borders and immigration. What's been happening in the United States has not felt natural. So here's Clint.
Whether you think that we should be building a wall and deporting people, or we should just be defunding the United Nations and limiting in some regard the immigration flood, I don't know exactly what the correct answer is. All I know is you have to have more to say about it right now, because this is actually a global government plot. It really is. And I know I sound like Alex Jones, or I sound like a crazy person to say a global government plot, but that's what it is. I looked. Yeah, I looked into it, and that's what I discovered. No one told me this. This was my own research. If anybody wants to just people will challenge me on, that's not libertarian. But you know what they won't challenge me on? What I'm saying right now. They won't actually contend with what I'm arguing, that this is actually a global government plot, that tens of billions of dollars are being robbed from us, handed out to the United Nations, which then hands them to NGOs, which then assists the migrants in the process of the multi-millions of them coming into our country every single year. If that's what you think is, the proper libertarian answer to the border issue, I just respectfully disagree.
The globalists, they're taking over. Look, no matter how you feel about immigration, there's something going on that isn't just people seeking a better life. And I'm pretty much on the side of open borders. I prefer people to be able to move freely and live where they want. I think a lot of people would prefer to stay in their home if they could. And there are a lot of artificial incentives that displace these people. And who's behind it? Is it a global cabal of nefarious characters? Is it just the United States bullying its way around the world? Is it one all-powerful trillionaire that is pulling the strings and moving all the game pieces? I don't know. So I'm not going to go too deep into the politics here. Just want to say that whether it's demons or just bad people with an agenda, something's not right. And I think you feel it. I know it's not just me. Even if you're not paying much attention, I hear a lot of people express that there's an ominous feeling out there. It's not just the news, I don't think. Maybe social media feeds into it. Well, actually, I take that back. Definitely, social media plays into it. The people in power use social media to get to us, and they play on our feelings for their own purposes. I talked to Matthew Lysiak, the author of the book Fiat Food, why he thought people were so susceptible to doomsday ideologies like climate change or anything else that the government uses to get us to accept their control over us. Here's what he said.
I think that throughout history, there's been a play on guilt, and we're susceptible to guilt. I think that's a highly effective tool for the government to use. So do you remember when the COVID shot came out? One of the big marketing tools wasn't that it was going to help you. It's going to help other people.
Yeah.
And if you can make somebody feel guilt, like really feel it, then I think you can control them. And I mean, I think that sadly, a lot of these powerful entities play off of guilt. Don't eat that cheeseburger. You're going to change the weather for everybody if you eat that cheeseburger.
Yeah.
Don't miss your 8th COVID booster because you're going to kill that woman's grandmother who has MS. I mean, that's always seems to be the tactic. And I think the opposite of that is self-empowerment and self-autonomy and being just independent, which is why I appreciate you doing this podcast. It's like giving these heretical ideas a voice. It's like people talk about the civil war in America that's underway between Republicans and Democrats. I look at it very differently. I think there's a group of elite credentialed authorities and people who believe them and are under them and want them to be in power. And on the other side, I see as people who've lost faith in these credentialed authorities and are now like empowering themselves, much like the Christianity went through hundreds of years ago, where there was a movement against the priest when the printing press made the Bible accessible to everybody. So like, I don't actually need you to understand God's will now. I can read the New Testament myself, and Jesus is telling me I can do it kind of myself. Like, why am I giving you 10% of my wealth? I think there's something hideous happening right now with the desire to manipulate people to not have faith in themselves. I guess I know that's a long-winded way of saying it. But that's a tough question, man.
Yeah, not an easy one. I'm sure there's some anxiety about modern life, and that might explain some of it.
Yeah.
If you look at all our systems,
anxiety though, like, is it real? Like, so we all have anxiety as humans, but I think a lot of it is just we're always told to be anxious about something. But in my life, with 4 daughters, right? I have where I live, if I don't turn media on, I don't feel a lot of anxiety. Like I feel pretty good. It's
True.
Give me 30 minutes in front of Fox News or MSNBC, and my blood pressure will go up by 12 points. So I think a lot of it's contrived, and I think that anxiety is also a lever for control because
Absolutely. Guilt is used as a tool against us. Almost everyone wants to help people, wants others to thrive, and doesn't want discrimination based on immutable characteristics. So people who crave power use this against us. And like Matthew said, when you turn on the news, that's what you're going to see. Amidst the tribal signaling and making you feel good about yourself, it's the same thing, but reversed, signaling that the other side is evil, that they lack all compassion, and that if they had their way, they would be locking you all up, or worse. And that's just not reality. Where those feelings do exist, it really comes from this messaging. But if we want to live together, and no matter how much we sort ourselves, we're always going to have to live together to some extent, we have to understand each other. And we have to ignore the crap that comes out of the media and listen. I had Mark Puls on the show, which if you follow me, you know we now do a weekly show together called Consciously Unmasked. But he talked about something he calls weaponized compassion. It's a very similar concept to what Matthew talked about with guilt, but it's people using it on each other. Here it is.
Richard Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene, and it spoke about how we are in it for ourselves, right? And what we're finding is that community seems to work better. But community is an evolved idea because it's, once again, worked, right? It's been functional. So when I talk about the compassion part, let's use COVID. Real great example. People were vax injured. Now, some people are willing to take that risk, but you didn't even know that was a risk you were taking, right? So you didn't even have the information. So you're being lied to this whole time, right? So you try to share it with people and you're like, guys, you're being manipulated. They're lying to you. You know what I mean? COVID is not this thing that it is. It's not good, but try to get healthier. Try to supplement. Take some vitamin D at least, Yeah, don't take the horse dewormer, fine. But, just do something. Get some fresh air, whatever. So they kept pushing that narrative. And how bad did it get? What was it? Don't kill your grandmother. You got to get vaccinated. You got to get vaccinated. And I literally just posted this 2 days ago, and someone goes, oh my gosh, it wasn't for the vaccine. Some people died waiting too long for it. And when I talk about weaponizing compassion, well, okay, you're correct. Some people may have benefited from this vaccine. That's possibly true. I do know people who suffered from being forced to take it too. So where's the compassion there? So when you weaponize compassion, unfortunately, it can only go in one certain direction that you weaponize it. It can't go the other way. So it automatically makes anyone not in that the enemy in some weird way, and it separates us more.
Makes sense. And was that convincing for that person?
No, it never is. It's
It never is.
Remember what you said.
Yeah.
You feel it, and then you come up with the idea after. That's how the compassion's weaponized, right? Look,
So weaponizing compassion is something you'll often see from people who would commonly be referred to as on the left. And compassion is great. People who identify themselves on Team Blue would often score higher in compassion. But like any good thing, it can be taken to a fault. What? You don't care about grandma dying? You don't care about trans genocide? And even when these people are sincere about it, and I think most of the people are, the politicians are not, but even when they're sincere about it, it can be taken to a weaponized form, like Mark said. And at that point, it becomes counterproductive. It doesn't convince people because it gets to an almost absurd level where you don't consider any other consequence of that action that you'd like to think is compassionate. And then it doesn't seem genuine, and when I might mention another issue, it just gets brushed off. So how can I be expected to care about your worries when you don't signal that you care about mine? So, when people try to match that energy and throw it back, it just doesn't work either. There's a fundamentally different understanding of facts, and ignoring of other variables. And this phenomenon is something that we have to contend with in any society. There are going to be people primed for compassion and hyper-focused on one issue that may have their hearts in the right place, and may even be right about something, but can't or won't comprehend the bigger picture. And somehow we have to reason with them. That leads me to the next topic. I'm going back to Andrew Heaton to look at a technique for sharing and understanding people in other camps. In his book, Tribalism is Dumb, he talks about the different lenses that people see things through. Republicans, generally speaking, will see things in a civilization versus barbarism frame. You can see that in the way that they talk about radical Islam, or are generally more prone to support wars and American dominance. Progressives tend to see the world as oppressor versus victim. Hopefully that one is obvious. And as libertarians, we see things in a coercion versus voluntary lens. And that's something to keep in mind when you try to communicate with others. It's not easy, but remember that they're viewing events in a completely different way than you. And they're not necessarily wrong, even if you have a different conclusion. Anyway, here's Andrew with a way to break through those different ways of thinking. Another thing you talk about is Bayesian reasoning. I've been seeing this everywhere, so I feel like I have to bring it up. What is Bayesian reasoning? How does it help avoiding these arguments?
Bayesian reasoning is a great mental tool that I wish I'd learned 20 years ago. But as it is, I only learned it about 5 years ago. So so how about this? Jason, do you believe in ghosts?
No.
Okay. That's normally how we think of beliefs. I don't believe in ghosts, right? Bayesian reasoning would be like this. I 80%, this is true. I 80% don't believe in ghosts. I 20% kind of believe in ghosts. And it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is very largely I don't think they're real, but there is this little niggling bit in my mind of like some credible sources that I know personally that have seen a ghost. And so, yeah, I don't think there are ghosts. If I had to bet on it, I'd say no, and I'd be very certain about it. But I'm not 100% certain. Like there are things I'm 100% certain on. The sun will rise in the east tomorrow. That is about as certain as I'm 99% certain about that. But like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like with the recent tariff thing with Mexico and Canada. I'm very anti-tariff. I'm very pro-free trade. Trump seemed to use it as a negotiation tactic. So like, should Trump use that as a negotiation tactic? I'd say like 70%. No, he shouldn't. But like, there's a little bit of like Bayesian reasoning. You're communicating how confident you are in something. And I think the benefit to that is twofold. If you and I are going to have an argument, like you're in favor of there being zero gun laws at all anywhere in America. And I'm like, well, how strongly do you feel on that? What is your confidence in that? And you're like 99%. There should never be any gun law ever under any circumstance, including prisons. People in prisons should be allowed to have guns. I'd be like, okay, interesting. Mm-hmm. I now know that this is not going to be a good debate. I shouldn't argue. If you're 99% confident on this, I'm not going to even have a chance to argue with you. So let's just talk about how you got there. Like, help me understand how you got there a little bit better.
So I'm about 99% sure that I'm going to be using that concept in my communication around politics. I think you guys understand. Andrew's such a great articulator of things that the point should be obvious. Leaving a little room for uncertainty allows people to step into a conversation in an area that there might not be any real agreement. So if your goal is to try to convert people or even just understand them, this can be a helpful tool. I could have clipped that entire episode with Andrew because it's so good, but I'll leave you to go watch it for yourself if you haven't yet. But speaking of certainty, this was a little thing that caught my attention. Because I love to learn about economics, I had the great opportunity to talk to Per Bylund, and he told me to pronounce it that way in case you think I'm doing it wrong. He's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute and a great Austrian school economist. I've seen so many examples of market regulation causing bad effects that I generally consider myself a free market absolutist, because when you get down to who's doing the regulating, you always run into problems. And I'm somewhere north of 90% certain that markets should be allowed to be free, even for things that you don't like. This will seem like a change in subject, and yeah, I guess it is a little bit, but I promise I'm tying it back together because I do like to focus on economics. And as Econ Bro said in part 1, people mostly just care about how it works for them. How do they benefit? And when you understand how economics works, you understand that leaving people to operate toward their own goal is the best way to keep people thriving. So I do care about ethics and morality, but maybe you could make a case that doing something immoral would be better for people in the long run. You might be able to convince me to do something immoral if it meant a huge benefit for humanity. Something like taking out an evil dictator before he could implement his plans to enslave the world. Luckily, we don't have to make that case here because in economics, the moral thing and the beneficial thing are the same thing. So yeah, I believe in free markets, but I noticed even Per, as an expert, communicated some uncertainty in this clip. And it's quick, but it opens up a chance for someone to discuss with him, rather than just shutting it down from the start. He's talking about how regulations affect the economy in ways that most people don't even think about. The secondary, tertiary effects that are not explicit in the goal of the regulation in the first place. So let's see it.
So one is that just because regulations are really costly doesn't mean that there should be none. That's not the conclusion, right? What I'm saying with the unrealized is, well, we are already doing these analyses. Is this regulation worth it? And what are the consequences and things like that, right? It's just that no one has figured out what the regulations actually do. So they're doing it on a false basis. Regulations are much, much more costly than we thought. So we wouldn't have chosen all of these regulations had we just calculated it correctly and considered the reality of the economy, if you will. So that's part of it. So there could be regulations where we say, well, this is important enough to accept the cost of it, even though the cost is enormous. That's perfectly fine.
So if you caught that, he says there could be some regulations where we say, this is important enough that we accept the cost, allowing that it's possible there could be a good reason for regulated economies. So I will take that and I'll give it some thought and maybe dial in a little bit more uncertainty when I talk about free markets. I would at least be open to hearing a case where a regulation was absolutely necessary. But you also then have to concede that it's going to have more of an effect than just the primary one that you're aiming for. So I like that, and I thought it tied in well with the running theme here. Just for a little more from Per, let's hear something about economic production in his episode that I did with him about economic literacy. I asked him to go over the argument that many people make, left and right, who believe that we need regulation, otherwise we'd be in a world of a few billionaires who monopolize everything and gain control over us that way. Here's what he said.
The other is what you mentioned, that, well, everything will be monopolized and you would have these rich capitalists who would exploit everybody and things like that. That is a great indication of being economically illiterate to claim those things. Because if you are economically literate, you know that, well, the market is just exchange. So if that is the case and consumers decide whether to buy or not, that means producers are in the business of serving consumers. So who benefits from creating a new, much more valuable good? Well, the consumer does, because the consumer chooses to buy it. If a lot of consumers choose to buy this thing that is of so much greater value, and that means that whoever produced it also makes a profit, that profit is just a fraction of the value the consumers are getting from this. And someone calculated that Jeff Bezos, he only gets like 1% or something like that of the value that Amazon produces. And this, of course, is based off of all kinds of assumptions that I would probably not agree with. So it's probably much less. But we see it and we think, no one is worth that much. But if you add together, what value does each and every person have from using Amazon.com compared to a world where there was no such thing? Well, right. That value is enormous, because otherwise people wouldn't do it, right? And Jeff Bezos has just a small part of it. Okay, so isn't he a monopolist then? Well, I mean, Amazon they're benefiting from a lot of regulations that's stopping others from doing it. But it's also the case that you can only stay the leading producer of some service or good if you continue to be the best in terms of satisfying consumers. So there are plenty of big businesses that no one could compete with throughout history that we've all forgotten about because they are bankrupt. So no one can compete with Sears Roebuck because they're big, they're everywhere, and they have low prices. Well, where are they now? They don't exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why? Because it's competition for creating value for consumers. It's not competition for being the biggest business, because that's usually just overhead and bureaucracy and stuff like that, right? It's cost, not value. And any entrepreneur can, at any point in time, undermine any huge business if they just figure out a new way of satisfying consumers in a better way. And that is an insight that you get pretty immediately from just a little bit of economic literacy. But people instead, they tend to, they fall back to sort of I don't know where it comes from really, but we seem to be born Marxists, and then some of us grow out of it. And the problem is that the Marxist assumptions, a lot of people cling to them because they can hide behind them, and they can sort of mask their own failures by saying it's not my fault. We're all exploited or something like that.
I like that thought at the end, kind of that we're all born Marxists and some of us grow out of it. Like it would be great if we all got our basic needs met automatically in life, but like Per says often, poverty is the default condition. So when or if you grow up enough to realize that life is a struggle, you also realize that providing something for people means that someone else has to work for it. When you learn more, you understand that it's not easy to create value at scale, and that people making a lot of money isn't necessarily a bad thing because they've provided some value to consumers to get there, assuming that they didn't use force or steal from people. And there are more levels that everyone should get to, but unfortunately, most people don't even get that far. So I had to include some of that just for the learning's sake. Economics is much more than stock markets and hedge funds and rich people. It's the decisions that we make every day, trying to meet our needs and better our lives. Every choice you make affects someone else. Every transaction you make ostensibly creates value for both parties, assuming that it's voluntary. Otherwise, why would you do it? This really shouldn't be political, but even the understanding of how things work tends to go that way. When things get complex, it's easy to obfuscate and present a limited set of facts that support your preferred outcome. But, like my guests have been saying, it doesn't really come down to policy or factual disputes. It's about finding a tribe for protection, and that mostly entails emotional protection in modern times. And that means that we can show people exactly how they're wrong and show them a better solution, but if we don't have an established tribe for them to go to, we might not get anywhere. And that's because we're fighting over control, not truth. Here's Keith Knight of the Libertarian Institute talking about just that. In another podcast, you shared a quote that I really liked. It's by Chris Freeman. It says, "We're vulnerable to politically motivated reasoning. The unconscious goal of our political deliberation is not to find truth, but rather to protect our identity as a loyal member of our political team." How does that manifest in politics today?
Well, when I first give the examples of how there's no good justification for the minimum wage, or there's no good justification for the unavoidable antitrust contradiction, you have to ask yourself, how could so many people believe something so blindly? Not just so many people, so many experts who have spent decades on this. So when I came across that explanation as to why people believe things, it made a heck of a lot more sense that it's about signaling allegiance to a tribe in hopes of having a community that you could fit in, that you could survive in, and you could pass your genes down into the future. That makes a heck of a lot more sense than any response I've gotten to the minimum wage argument or, the pro-war advocacy from any of these groups. So I was basically looking for, how could so many people believe such ridiculous things? And I think that really fits the bill more than anything else, because these things are just so shocking. You have people saying with a straight face, we have to support Ukraine and oppose Russia because Ukraine's a democracy. Well, on March 31st of this year, Zelensky was supposed to hold elections, didn't hold elections, and they didn't stop supporting Ukraine. He's enslaved all men ages 18 to 60 to fight in a war against their will. Another word for slavery, forced labor, and they still support him. Uses martial law to nationalize TV outlets into one channel, bans political parties, and all these experts with all these degrees still say, well, yeah, they're the democracy, and the other people are authoritarian. The fact that anyone can say that with a straight face after everything that's happened, and I'm very pro-Ukraine, which is why I hate Zelensky. All of these politicians usually operate at the expense of their populations and use them as cannon fodder for their own self-interest. So that was one of the best explanations I came across as to why people engage in political activity when they really don't seem that interested. I mean, I've come across people with degrees who have never heard any argument in opposition to the minimum wage or antitrust legislation. So if you think of, say you get pulled over by the police and they say, do you have any weapons on you? Before I let you go, are there any unregistered guns in the car? And you say no. And then the cop searches you and finds out, you lied and you do have a 3D printed gun or something. One way to approach that is to say, that's so weird that the person didn't tell the reality to the cop because they had to have known. And the answer is, well, the goal isn't truth. The goal is to keep yourself safe from the officer. Mm-hmm. So when we're asking ourselves, why do people believe such trash when it comes to politics? Well, the goal isn't truth. Unfortunately, the goal is to signal allegiance to a tribe. So just as your goal isn't truth when you're talking to the IRS or a police officer, sometimes your boss, sometimes your spouse or family members, the goal is just survival. With politics, it's almost the exact same thing. So we don't see a lot of truth because the goal is not truth. The goal is survival and being surrounded by like-minded people.
Yes. Scott Adams has a similar theory. He says once you pick a side, you're basically giving up objectivity at that point. Like, once you identify with the team, that's part of your self. So it's really hard to change your mind. How do you avoid that personally?
Well, I try to make my identity the person who is willing to change. So I'm happy to concede that I've been wrong about a number of things in the past. And when you make your identity, I'm open to changing, then it's a lot easier to change.
There's a reason I did 2 whole episodes on tribalism. It's central to understanding politics or any area of human behavior. And if we're going to make progress in liberty, that is much more critical than having all the right answers about each and every problem that people can come up with. Like Keith says, the goal for most people, in most cases, is not truth. But rather than cling to a specific political label or rigid framework, a better way would be to identify as someone who's willing to change. I love that. That's what I'm striving for. More than promoting anarchy or even limited government, I'm looking for ways to break people out of patterns that don't serve them. And that includes myself. I'm open to being wrong. I've been through that painful part where you have to question beliefs that you've lived your entire life. And it wasn't easy. But now, it would be a little bit better because of that experience, I'm able to hold strong beliefs in a looser way. I've sought out facts and logic and I can back up what I know, but I'm always open to something better because I can't know everything. And sometimes I do wonder if it's even worth it to advocate against government. I talked to Jason Fry about that, and I'm circling back to religion here. We talked about the line in the Bible that is often quoted as an endorsement of taxation, where Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's." This was around the context of his book, National Divorce, A Plan for Peace, and it led to this.
My interpretation of that story is you are free to stand on your values, but the government may still smite you. Right? You may win. You may negotiate on your values and the government says, cool, that's a good idea, like the vegetables. Or you may stand on your values and they say, not cool, we're going to throw you in with the lions or the fire. That the government has that option if you rebel. Rebel is a word that Paul uses as well. So if you say, I'm not going to play, there's potential for earthly consequences to go with that. I would say if you say, I'm going to break my spiritual principles, there's heavenly consequences to go with that. So it's a trade-off. That's why Paul, at the end of the day, says kind of your conscience is going to have to decide. So that's the way I take. That's the way I take it. Is that, to me, negotiated separation is not rebellion. It's not violence. It's not unbiblical. It's not prohibited. But it carries with it the risk of retaliation by the secular government. That's the way I interpret the scriptures there. And as a Christian myself, I thought, well, let's look and see what scripture has to say about that. So that's where I land. It's an option on the table. Like it is not like advocating for some sinful thing, but it is within the realm of possibilities. And that's as far as I stop. I don't go so far as to say, and so we should. The Bible says we should separate. Now, there are examples of that. So the Bible says it's possible, but I don't think we have any guidance on whether that's the best course for now or not.
Like I said, I'm not particularly religious, but I do often wonder if I waste my time doing this. Should I just, go along and let God handle it? And I really don't know what the best way is, but
that's a
I think
appealing option sometimes.
Something to be said. What's that?
So that's a pretty appealing option sometimes, is to just say,
it is.
Well,
yes.
God's going to handle it. And that's true. I think that's a biblical option, is to say the government's going to do what the government's going to do, so I'm going to feed my children and be nice to my neighbors, right? I think there's absolute validity to that perspective.
So it's definitely an option, to say that I can't really change things and I'm leaving it in God's hands. And I don't begrudge anyone for not getting involved and instead focusing on their own life and their own family. I still think about this a lot. I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, for one, because too many people just don't seem to want freedom or care. And it may just be a lost cause to try to convert people, considering all the advice and wisdom that I've heard throughout this process. But something in me just can't let it go. And I know these principles are good and moral, and I want my posterity to live in a world that isn't dominated by authoritarian freaks and mindless slaves who fall in line with it. So whatever the consequences, I'm here to keep trying to tell people the truth. The government may not like that, the people may not like it, because most of us have been trained to think that truth is bad when it goes against our tribal beliefs. I asked Jack Lloyd what it would take to get over the seemingly invincible statist mindset. Here's what he said. Yeah, well, I really like the entire premise and the tagline, humanity's last stand against government, spoke to me, obviously, as an ANCAP as well. And it would be awesome if we had some superpowered individuals fighting against it. Do you think that's what it would take to get over the hump and actually knock government down?
I mean, it definitely takes some level of superhero psychology, because there's so many things pulling at people to compromise day in, day out. The media and the government and just even people on the inside who tell you to compromise, tell you to sell out, tell you that you'll never win, tell you you're stupid, you're nothing, you're, autistic, or, you can never be real world, all that stuff. It's nonstop. So it does take like almost a superhero level of intellectual resilience to stay the course and stay principled through and through, because you have every type of thing you can imagine telling you to stop. Whether it's people who are just pure antagonists like communists and socialists, or even people who supposedly are on your side. They claim to be libertarian in name, or they claim to be, ANCAP, fewer of those, but, they claim to love liberty, and they want to shut you up and they want to shut you down. For staying principled and speaking out, in the same way that someone might be a slavery abolitionist. It could be the year 1650. And you're like, you're crazy. We could never get rid of slavery. It's natural. And what would the slaves do? They wouldn't be able to read or hold jobs, right? You'd have the whole world against you and saying all of human history is slavery, slavery, slavery. You're never getting rid of it. You just have to deal with it and make it a little better. But the abolitionists of that time and going forward said, no, we're going to stay principled even if we can't achieve it in our lifetime. We're going to just keep passing the intellectual ball forward, and eventually we will have enough cultural resistance that'll become something. And then suddenly it does. And enough people in the world have become anti-slavery that people take it for granted now. Right now, if you ask any average person in the street and you'd say, "Are you for human slavery, like just chattel slavery?" They'd look at you like a weirdo. Like, of course they're against slavery. But you can go back even 100, 150 years ago, and you'd have the average person maybe say, "Well, yeah, we need it," or it's part of life, even if it's not the best. You know what I mean? So I don't think that people appreciate how quickly that changed. In terms of number of years, culturally, intellectually, in that short span of time, going back 1800s to today. In terms of your average person, what do they think about slavery? So I appreciate that. I have a very longitudinal view on culture change, and so I don't back down from those things, even if people say you're not realistic, you're not pragmatic, you're just living utopian fantasies. It doesn't bother me because I'm here to do the educational work and lay those principles. And whether it's happening in my lifetime or not, I don't care. My goal is to help people become principled and to lead to sustainable change and action. And those people are going to pay that forward for their kids, and then their kids, for their kids and so forth, if those principles are held as a cultural norm, which is not weird. It's, that's the drift of every cultural norm throughout history, right? Nothing ever just is day one, it's totally different. Day two, it's something else. It's typically takes time and evolution of ideas and people adopting and changing. So
he makes some really good points. And a key thing to remember is that people have held all kinds of incorrect or immoral beliefs on a societal level at different points in time. And the few people fighting against it were seen as crazy or stupid or whatever. But then it changed. Change is possible. So I'm not ready to give up on it. And I don't know exactly how to get there, but that's why I'm doing this, to find people that are doing good things and help share the message. People like Jack with his storytelling, and people like you'll see in the next clip who are doing real work to help individuals through You Are the Power. This is Spike Cohen, and here he talks about the fundamentals of libertarian ideology. And it's very simple. Let's see it.
So the bottom line, if you look at all of the philosophical underpinnings of libertarianism, non-aggression, self-ownership, individual autonomy, individualism, property rights, all of it boils down to respecting the fact that each one of us is an individual human being, giving that respect to others and having that respect from others. It is from that respect. So when I say respect, I don't necessarily mean that you respect someone's opinion or who they are as an individual, just that they are an individual. It's that intrinsic level of human respect. It's the reason why we don't step on other people the same way we would step on an insect or something like that. We intuitively understand that a human being is different than an animal or an insect or an object. It's a human being. And it's where all these other ideas come from. When you say don't hurt people and don't take their stuff, someone else could say, why? Why can't I hurt people or take their stuff? And if you say, well, because it's wrong, and they say, yeah, well, says who? Like, what makes that wrong? And, a lot of people will say, well, my faith or my God tells me that it's wrong, or, I just, believe deep down that it's wrong. But even all of those things boil down to why? Why did your God or your faith say it was wrong? Why do you deep down feel that it's wrong? It's because intuitively we understand that we have to respect one another, or that we do respect one another as individual human beings. When we respect one another as individual human beings, we are at our most prosperous, our most harmonious, and our happiest. And anytime we see crime or war or bad policy from government or theft or harm or anything else, it is when individual human beings are not being treated and respected as individual human beings. They're being treated as a mark or a target. They're being treated as a funding opportunity or a political opposition or an obstacle or something like that, but they're not being seen as a human being. And so when we boil it down to that, then that's a message that you could explain to a 7 or 8-year-old. And not only would they agree with it, they'd already believe it. They'd be able to finish your sentence for you.
It's not a complicated message, and that's what every libertarian and really everyone should be committed to, respecting people as individuals. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people even view themselves that way. They don't even show themselves the respect that they should be extending to others. And the reasons for that are many, but it's another fact of life that we're going to have to deal with. it might be a good place to start, rather than any political action, is just helping others come to that understanding. Take all the politics away, because when you don't have a basic respect for yourself as an individual, not just as a body in a group, then you're not going to get the rest of it. There are a lot of forces that push against that, and everything that the government does, from schooling to taxation, fighting wars, and even public health campaigns, are designed to frame you as the one who must sacrifice for the collective. And I won't even say that that's never a good thing to do, but it never seems to come back in your favor when the government does it. Not really. Collectively, even when we should expect, with the innovation and exponential increases in our productivity, our quality of life should improve in kind, but it hasn't. Something's seriously wrong. So I'm still also committed to that message, but going forward, it's going to take a backseat, I think. I do think there's hope. I see it every day, and I know I've collected myself a nice bubble on the internet, but I see more and more people who can see through the facade every single day. I talked to Michael Rectenwald, and I asked him what his white pill is, despite all the negative things happening in the world and the state of humanity.
Yeah, I think people are getting it. I think the people are waking up. I think anarcho-capitalism is an idea whose time is really is dawning on us, and I think that if we don't have so-called Have Malay moment right now, we're on the precipice of it. I'm trying to inaugurate that and precipitate it as best I can with the powers and the capabilities that I have in writing. You know, people have commented that I'm not the greatest speaker on earth. Okay, I'm a damn good writer. And I can get a message out that way too. The point is, the white pill that I would leave is, look, as long as we're alive, there's hope, and we have the ability to change things. We have the ability to think, and we have the ability to undermine the regime that's poised on us, that's poised against us. And there are many people that see through it. And we need to just rally those people. I don't even expect to convert that many people. Conversion is a very tough thing. What we need is to rally the people that already are in the know, the remnant, and bring them into this, and then we'll be on our way.
I like that, and to be honest with myself, I did not do a great interview with Rec. That's why it's such a small part in this two-part series. It was only my second interview ever, and I could have been much better. He also clearly had a goal to make some quick political talking points for his presidential campaign. We all know how that turned out, but I'd be happy to have him on again and do a better one away from the campaigning nonsense. But this part, at least, it was good, and I think it's a good place to leave it off. As long as we're alive, and there are people awake and self-respecting and fighting for liberty, there's always hope. So that's it for my two-part reflection series. If you followed me this far, I can't thank you enough. I really am. Well, I started doing this for me, to learn and to get better at speaking, but I also want to spread the message and help anyone who will listen, to give you guys my insight, to share the things that I learn along the way, and hopefully move the needle, even just a little bit, to a more prosperous future for everyone. So if you get something out of this, I would love to hear from you. Seeing those messages really motivates me to keep going. And looking ahead, my goal is to shift the focus a little bit more into psychology and philosophy. Politics is a black hole that will eat your soul. So I'm hoping that I can take another angle on it, and I hope that you stick with me. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back soon with more Drop the Mask. See you next time.